Canada, and it's a tag team. So I'll have an opportunity to introduce the beginning speaker, and I guess you're on your own in terms of Bruce, since you're following immediately from David Dudley. But I guess you could say this is the private sector response to the issue of sustainability. And I won't bore you with all the details. Hopefully they're going to be able to tell you a little bit about the specifics on their corporate engagement and what that means. You'll get an idea about their companies and their philosophy as to why they're doing what they're doing. And so without any further ado, this is David Denny's. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Well, thank you for this wonderful opportunity, and Melinda, your speech last night, this morning. Undoubtedly, you know, as we said in the private sector, this is a very complex global issue. And it does, as you discussed yesterday, require complex long-term strategies, but also immediate action. And one on the surface might just get overwhelmed with the complexity of our issue and just throw the towel in, or maybe even say, you know, what can I do? And our story today hopefully will illustrate that really anyone can make a difference. And our story really started out very serendipitously and almost not even related to the work that I do, but it evolved into essentially a sustainable energy initiative. And hopefully this works. We'll plan to come together. First I'll describe who we are to give you some context, and I'll start with Bruce Dudley of the Delphi group, who's going to join me in the back half of this presentation. They have a rich history in sustainability. I'm going to leave the description of what they do for his time on the podium. I'm from Insight Action. Insight Action essentially converts data into insight value to help organizations optimize asset performance. And we do it for oil production or offshore oil production. We have government utilities on our platform. One in particular I can think of is 360 terawatts of power going through, 80 gig demand, and that's not even the largest customer. We provide insights for commercial building energy consumption all over the world. We also provide marketing insights for the top line performance, and we also participate in transportation assets, for which I'm going to talk about. If you think about it, we participate in these segments, but are not limited to them, and the idea is to give our customers a real-time view to their ROI, so they can make decisions on the fly what they need to do. And one of the things that was discussed earlier was the ability to model and utilize benchmarks to understand with a degree of certainty predictive outcomes, and that's exactly what we do. Fleet Advantage is a division that's focused on the transportation segment, and what we do with fleet leaders essentially help them understand how to optimize and reduce their costs in terms of operating their fleets. And the largest expense related to fleets, other than the capital investment itself, is typically the fuel consumption cost. And so then, when you consider the fact that we provide insights to help with the fuel consumption alternatives and help reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by leveraging the notion of benchmarking to be able to do that, whether it's having the right kind of vehicle, aligned with the right utility, or preventive maintenance that helps optimize vehicle performance, reducing fuel consumption. It's not totally surprising that we would get a call from, and this is called production, but essentially it's the chairman of the board for the largest ethanol producer in Canada. And they contacted us and said, listen, we would like to understand the barriers of introducing a higher blend ethanol in retail. And on the surface, you're thinking, well, why would you even entertain that call? And so, well, you start thinking, we have demand. But consider that about 10% of the vehicles on the road today are controlled by central decision-making authorities. These are people that make decisions about how to utilize those transportation assets. And so why wouldn't we entertain that call? Why wouldn't we enable our fleet leaders to have access to alternative transportation energy solutions? And ethanol was the first conversation. And so then you start thinking about, well, they want to bring it to retail and talk about availability and what availability might look like. And very quickly you can start seeing something emerge. And I'm a businessman, and so I can start seeing a business model that I understand take place. And so you have a supply chain with economic potential, and oh, by the way, there's environmental and social benefits that we all understand. Now, very quickly, this blossomed into a larger conversation for which I'll illustrate, and is not limited to ethanol. As Bruce will tell you, we're fuel agnostic, and we'll describe just exactly why. The conversations that we started having, as important as they were from a social and environmental perspective, always had to start with the economic benefit. If it's not economically sustainable, the conversation dries up in about 5 seconds. So we started having conversations with ethanol and biodiesel, and at the time of those conversations, they were in pretty good stead, in good favor. That was going to be the future. And then you have all this conversation about food versus fuel and agricultural practices, and it gets a little convoluted. And then you have natural gas, electrification, and other solutions contacting us because of the momentum we established, saying, well, we'd like to participate in that as well. And before you know it, electrification falls out of favor, and the natural gas is the new sweetheart on our hill in Ottawa. And so when you talk to major political figures or stakeholders or influencers related to this conversation, they don't want to pick one. For a variety of reasons, it vacillates back and forth on what the right solution is going to look like. And are also engaged in a brutal tug-of-war amongst themselves, throwing stones at each other. And the tug-of-war obviously has got to be about what limited resources must be. The tug-of-war for me, though, new to the conversation, was a little perplexing. They're fighting over a market that doesn't exist yet versus working together to create one that they could later compete in. And so this notion of glass houses, and this was best illustrated at a convention for the Canadian Renewable Fuel Association in Calgary, where you had all of those solutions on the front row, and they would ask their questions of me in a way that kind of buried their neighbor. And I got to say, because I had no vested interest in that particular conversation, I said, you guys got to throw your sabers down. There's no market here. And then you start hearing this rhetoric about, there's no silver bullets. Yet everybody's behaving in a way like they're waiting for one. And so we say, you know what? Work together for 5 seconds without giving up your unique identity. You're each at different stages of commercial viability. You each have your concerns or your challenges. But you've got to work together and understand that it is going to be a different solution. We do have to mitigate our dependency on a single fuel source for whatever reason you might pick, and there's a variety of them. And by the way, it doesn't end there. This community that's going to make this successful and broaden availability has to include availability, which is the retailer. One of our early discoveries was, because these are emerging markets, they didn't know how to talk to the retailer. So they needed to be enabled. A conversation had to be facilitated. So the ethanol producers knew how to talk to the retailers, and the retailers knew how to talk to the ethanol producers, and so on and so forth. But it doesn't end there. It involves a variety of stakeholders. It's a difficult notion. And by the way, oil producers have to be at the table. I've met them all at the most senior level. And the reality is, yes, we have to mitigate our dependency on a single fuel source, but we all share some of the responsibility on getting where we are today. Quite frankly, I live a pretty healthy lifestyle, and largely due to the spoils that we get from the petroleum producers. So I'm not one of those guys to throw disparaging comments their way. I'm really more focused on talking about solutions. And so we created this vision around this community, and it's really about facilitating availability and use. And the mission was to grow sustainable fuel use by focusing on the things that the various stakeholders and influencers told us to focus on. And so you go back to that model that started to emerge, and we started developing our own model that started about aligning supply and demand and all those other elements which are critically important in pulling together. One of the conversations we had with some learned colleagues that have been doing this for many years is say, listen, it sounds like you guys are trying to boil the ocean. And so this is one that I took from Lakehead University. And there's another fellow, David Suzuki, who's got a rich history in Canadian leadership. And I grew up in Vancouver and always admired the work that he did. And I had the privilege to talk to him several times in this group. And one of the things that related to corn ethanol, which was interesting that you would bring that up. And they couldn't support corn ethanol in any way, shape, or form, but there was rich paperwork presented around the notion of next generation ethanol or biofuels. And I tried to explain to David, I said, I don't think you understand, you don't get there from here without some sort of critical mass, some sort of commercial viability. Let's do something. I mean, this picture can mean anything to anybody. They could talk to global warming or what have you. For me, it's more simplistic. The bear's got a decision to make. They could sit there and either drown or starve, or decide to do something and still drown or starve. The solution is he's got to do something as imperfect as it is. And that's where we are with all these different solutions that are percolating. They're flawed, every single one of them, for a variety of different reasons. But we have to do something. We should continue to put pressure on those independent solutions to improve. This is an example of essentially the first meeting of consequence that we were able to pull together. And it was through this dialogue that we had with the influencers and stakeholders that included the likes of the global sustainability team of Chrysler just down the road at Auburn Hills. And you can't imagine, when I first took on this project, I really had no business leading the conversation. But the fact that I was getting the meetings that I was indicated to me there was just a massive void, that nobody was having a conversation of consequence in real terms. In real terms, getting to an ROI, getting to a transaction of things that can actually be done. And so this roundtable is a real roundtable that actually occurred, where we sat down with a really seemingly disparate group of stakeholders and talked about what each person needed. And the whole notion of collaborating for mutual value is you have to understand and care about what's of value to the person next to you. And so we were invited up to Parliament. It was the first time in history, if you can believe it, that the energy, trucking and auto caucuses have ever met on one single subject. And it was about the conversation we were having. And so we brought up the global sustainability teams of Chrysler and some of the other monikers that you saw on that round table. And we indicated and demonstrated that this really could happen. We could find common ground. And getting back to that conversation that I said earlier about, it sounds like we're trying to boil the ocean. Well, my response is, listen, we may disagree on 100 things, but if we can find 5, that's 5 more than we had before. And so that conversation seemed to resonate up in Parliament in Ottawa, and so we got called back, and we got to speak to the Standing Committee of Transportation Infrastructure and Communities. And the conversations continue, and to the point now we're starting to transact. So we're bringing provincial leadership, the Ministry of Transportation, together with a major non-traditional retailer of petroleum to talk about what would it mean to build an alternative transportation infrastructure that not only the fleets related to the municipalities could use, but the broader Ontario motorists could use. And quickly now that's moved into another transaction where Waste Diversion Project, converting waste into methanol, wants to know how the same kind of conversation can happen. And so, in addition to that, we thought, you know what, let's leverage the people that we know to really kind of facilitate some more momentum. And that goes right up to the senior leadership of Walmart, Costco, and the like. And they're very good at mandating supplier compliance. And so what if you created a robust accreditation program and got their buy-in where they could mandate supplier compliance? And all of a sudden now, you have this whole transportation segment related to the supplier community and retail looking at what they need to do to improve their performance. We created a movie because my conversations with the people that I was having was almost barely believable. Data is my background. The fact that I was able to garner attention with our Premier and a great majority of our MPs at the federal level, it was almost unbelievable to my compatriots because it happened in such a short time, that we said, let's build a movie, let's build a program that demonstrates that this has really happened and really possible. And so we did that. And we've been invited back to speak to some of the leaders of our country in terms of how our progress is moving forward. And we continue to engage provincially and municipality-wise, and you do have to tackle all levels of government. It's interesting, when I looked at the theme that Anne Marie sent us, I thought it was so well aligned with some of the work that we were actually doing. And by the way, a lot of the work we just decided to do because it needed to be done. We're not being paid for this. This is a benevolent cause. My core proposition is data insights. And when we got this momentum, one of the first things I thought of was, I was aware of the work that the Delphi group was doing to get a rich 25-year history in sustainability and integrating with government and multiple stakeholders. And things got real bright when they decided to take on the role of secretariat. Because quickly I knew, because of the momentum we were having, I better infuse some credibility into this conversation with some good leadership, and that's exactly why Bruce is on board. The time is now. We got to move quickly. At the same time, we have to build out long-term strategies. And we do have to make it economically sustainable. Somehow, when I've met a lot of people in environmental NGOs and alike, and they focus on, well, we got to do it because it makes sense, it's the right thing to do. Well, I get that, but the brutal reality in our world is that it has to be sustainable in all three segments. It's a three-legged stool. If one's gone, the stool's tipping over. So you do have to tackle the economic sustainability. With that, I'm going to invite my colleague, Bruce, up to describe a little bit about the credibility that he lends to the conversation that we've started. So with that, Bruce, please.
Thanks very much, Dave's benevolent cause is my business partner's heartburn. But you know, to be honest, well, I want to start by thanking the organizers at MSU and the UN for having Dave and I down for this discussion. We think it's very important and very timely, but I would also be remiss if I didn't thank Dave and his business partner Mike Green, because without Dave's dogmatism and his unique way that he asks questions and poses issues to the players in this energy space, it would have never come to this. And it actually has come to a lot without coming to anything, because what we have is, I think, a lot of interest in terms of how this conversation can take shape and result in transactions that are going to advance the sustainability of energy in Canada, and I believe in the US and elsewhere as well. But we haven't made the ask yet. There are many people who have offered to fund the creation of this entity, but we've held off on doing that because we want to make sure that we get the terms that are going to actually contribute to the advancement, and not get stuck in some things like industry associations where it's sort of a race to the bottom, where you're trying to boil everything down to something people can agree to instead of really taking the leadership challenge forward. Anyway, oh, I've got this thing, right? It's not too often I actually get the remote in my hand. You
Right.
appreciate that? But... Oh, sorry.
The other way.
The other way, thank you. Yeah, just shows you I'm quite incompetent. This first slide, Dave was talking about 25 years of rich history. We've actually been around since 1988, and one of our early investors, benefactors, was Morris Strong, who was a principal at Rio, and Belinda knows Morris. Well, Ken, Morris's son, was one of the original shareholders in Delphi, going back a few years ago. Another story, Delphi had an office in London, England, and we were actually invited to Downing Street for the first conversation on climate change. So we've been around for a long time. My sons keep asking me, well, clearly we're not doing things well because we haven't solved anything, but you know, I don't take that to heart. We've done a lot of different projects for a lot of different clients. The picture that you see at the bottom right is, I thought I'd share this because of the conversation last night. We used to be the chief carbon consultants to CEDA, the Canadian International Development Agency, and we decided that we couldn't keep giving them strategy unless we actually got our hands on a project. So we did an off-grid electrification project involving photovoltaics in a small Argentine community in Argentina. And so we actually were probably one of the most successful climate change projects they had. We learned a tremendous amount, and it was just fascinating to be involved in that off-grid distributed energy type approach that we had. But the way we are today is a lot different than the way we used to be. We still dabble in policy and in government, but we're almost entirely private sector oriented. And our climate change, corporate sustainability, clean tech